Hello and welcome to the Antedote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Couchot.
Jeremy, we're going to continue with, picking up from where we left off last week with relation to September 11th, and you just tying together 17 years later, looking at where I think a direction that you and I believe that those who are serious about exposing, bringing out the truth, and really investigating the truth about, or where it appears to lead as far as September 11th, with the benefit of hindsight, and also with the benefit of looking at current events 17 years later, where we believe the direction that a lot of research and a lot of questions should be headed into. And it's rather interesting thinking about this list that we talked about a few weeks ago when we discussed Arthur Finkelstein and his primary key role in shaping this this hard right kind of populist wing that he was cultivating for years, that he really has come to gain a lot of power and influence in Western countries just in the last few years. We discussed this list of donors to Donald Trump and to Netanyahu and his first campaign when he ran for prime minister for the second time in 2008, when he was putting together his list of donors, and some of the names on this list, including I was thinking about obviously a Ronald Lauder, who was on the New York Port Authority, who is now the head of the World Jewish Congress, one of Donald Trump's biggest Jewish defenders from a global perspective. And of course, that ties you into some of the other people that Donald Trump has had relationships with over the years that are directly involved with some of the financial aspects of September 11th, particularly relating to the New York Port Authority and the leasing and giving of property to one Larry Silverstein. And of course, those names would include people such as Louis Eisenberg, who was the chairman of the New York Port Authority, who is now the ambassador to Italy under Trump. That would also include Michael Glassner, who was one of Eisenberg's deputies, who went on to be a regional APAC director, and I believe he's heading Trump 2020. I know he had a major role in the 2016 campaign. I think Glassner is also involved with the re-election campaign.
Yep.
But, you think
he's heading it up.
Okay. Good to know. Trump 2020. So, Glassner's still on board. That's good to know. But you think about these names, and then you think about a lot of these and the connection a lot of these people have in common would be in areas such as, real estate and properties. And that, of course, is Donald Trump's specialty over the years, has been dealing with real estate and dealing with property. And then you tie in some of these other people within this Russiagate narrative that people just want to dismiss and act like is nothing. Then you, of course, Tamir Sapir was a major figure, was on Netanyahu's donor list. And then there are a few others as well. I believe, Len Blavatnik was on this list, among others. But, it's funny, we're thinking about this, and you tie all these real estate figures together to Donald Trump and to what's currently going on. And we've kind of identified perhaps the 11/9 operation as almost being like a follow-up to 9/11 in some ways, whereas you have this hardline kind of Zionist faction that is really loyal to Israel, even to an extent that the current U.S. Western establishment is not. And this almost seems like a continuation of maybe the policy coup that Wesley Clark described as taking place in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. And you think about all of these names, and there was once upon a time when the 9/11 quote-unquote truth movement actually discussed people like Larry Silverstein in relation to the World Trade Center and what happened on that day. And, of course, there were even limits on what they would discuss as far as Larry Silverstein, I think we may get into here in a few minutes. But you keep hearing these names like Silverstein or Glassner and Eisenberg, and the list just goes on and on and on. And all we hear about in relation to September 11th, it seems like, everywhere from a lot of the, anti-imperialist left to even someone like Alex Jones, who's just completely gone backwards in 9/11 in the age of Trump. All you hear about is Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia. Rather interesting that in the light of all these names, and that would be the people who actually have the means and motives to actually perhaps or the connections to the people who could very well bring down the World Trade Center. All we hear about is Saudi Arabia. I find that to be a rather interesting and rather disheartening phenomenon.
Very, very much so, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And last week, I proposed a three-part conceptual framework to dealing with September 11th as an event, and we're also working then and showing the threads that tie 9/11 to 11/9, the day that Trump was announced the quote-unquote winner of the 2016 election, meaning the next day, sort of late that night after midnight, I believe it actually happened. So there's, like I said last week, that I believe that this idea of using intelligence, military, and counterintelligence as a three-part conceptual framework is worthwhile doing, as long as 9/11 remains an act of war, which it blatantly is, because the tools of war are being used in the wake of it based on the ongoing interpretation through the vast majority of the mainstream and so-called alternative media in terms of what it was. And so, I mean, there's other ways we could approach that. We could approach it in terms of the journalist or story angle, the who, what, when, where, why, how, or the crime angle, the criminal or legal means, motive, and opportunity. And those conceptual frameworks might inform us too, but as long as 9/11 is being interpreted and being used to wage global warfare, including here in the so-called homeland in terms of the escalation of seditious acts against the Bill of Rights around things like the police state, the insertion of this sort of Stasi type apparatus, Homeland Security, that's vacuuming up law-abiding American citizens who do things like do First Amendment audits in relationship to public officials, public buildings, public official business, are being put onto through things like suspicious activity reports that I believe SARS reports was started by one William Bratton, who helped set up the first fusion center in outside of Los Angeles, and then introduced this whole idea of suspicious activity reports that then get put into when there's contact with a First Amendment auditor on the street, then if they can get any information about them, including their name, that's then put into a suspicious activity report and fed into so-called Homeland Security networks. So, what you said, Greg, in terms of this blatant link, in terms of Netanyahu's big donor list in relationship to one President Donald Trump, is pretty blatant. There's no other candidate for president in 2016 that I believe shows up on that big donor list for one Benjamin Netanyahu, who, as far as I know, is the only public official worldwide or elected leader of a government who publicly acknowledged 9/11 as a good thing.
I was just going to throw in there, Jeremy, certainly Hillary Clinton certainly wasn't on that list. And a matter of fact, it was people that are actually seem to be in media that are pretty close to the Netanyahu government that were actually leading the campaign to expose Hillary Clinton. So there's that also.
Yes, and the other thing is, I believe Donald Trump was the only candidate for during the 2016 campaign who also made a campaign video directly for Benjamin Netanyahu. I may be wrong about that, but as far as I know, he's the one.
I'm pretty sure you're right about that.
So we then wade into this issue of the material aspects of September 11th. Who got killed? Where did they get killed? How did they get killed? And then who did it and why? And you pointed out this Larry Silverstein connection, and there is this Haaretz story in the wake of September 11th. Came out November 21st, 2001, up in smoke. And you read into this very quickly. It says, 6 weeks before the terrorist attack in New York, Larry Silverstein leased the Twin Towers for 99 years, paying $3 billion. Their collapse was also the collapse of the deal of his life. And since then, he's been trying to put the pieces back together in the face of fierce public criticism, some of it anti-Semitic. His business dealings in Israel haven't given him much satisfaction either. Shortly after the events of September 11th, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called Larry Silverstein, a Jewish real estate magnate in New York, the owner of the World Trade Center's 110-story Twin Towers, and a close friend, to ask how he was. Since then, they have spoken a few more times. Two former prime ministers, Benjamin Netanyahu, who this week called Silverstein a, quote, friend, unquote, and Ehud Barak, whom Silverstein in the past offered a job as his representative in Israel, also called soon after the disaster. Yaakov Turner, the mayor of Be'er Sheva, sent a letter of condolence. Many Israeli politicians are acquainted in one degree or another with the 70-year-old Silverstein. For 10 years, he tried to bring about the establishment of a free trade zone in the Negev until the project fell apart. This is a tragedy, Silverstein, deeply disappointed, said then. All right, so then it talks about his attempts to rebuild and all of that. But it is very, very key to all of this that these two former prime ministers, on top of Ariel Sharon, have this very close relationship. Netanyahu, it later on says that they spoke every Sunday, like you said, for years and years and years, up into and probably through September 11th. Netanyahu and Silverstein, and Netanyahu said 9/11 was good. And then Ehud Barak, who was Silverstein had offered a job to. And Ehud Barak, the thing that ties Ehud Barak and Netanyahu together is not only that they're both former prime ministers, but they're also former Israeli Defense Forces special forces operatives, Sayeret Metkal, which I've brought up before is basically some type of special forces reconnaissance, special operations reconnaissance, so behind so-called enemy lines. And so what do you see? You see Ehud Barak on BBC television the day of September 11th, giving the clearest architecture of the intelligence legend of September 11th. Osama bin Laden,
war on terrorism.
Yes, exactly. War and the war on terror. He's articulating the war on terror, how there is going to be, and he's also beginning to articulate something. He's hinting at what you reference in relationship to Wesley Clark's disclosure of the plan running through the Pentagon in terms of 7 countries in 5 years, I think it was.
Yeah,
and
you know,
go for it.
Real quick, I was going to say, people, you know, you're just naming off a bunch of like names and all this, but I mean, when you actually not even an extensive, but a cursory glance at people like Larry Silverstein and others who were involved in this whole financial exchanging of properties, you'll find, if you even cursory look at any of these people and their backgrounds and what their passions, you'll find Israel and all. It's very obvious connections to not just to basic Israel, but very heavy devotion with all these people involved. So, you know, that shows in a very quick glance at these people's in their lives and their stories, much less an extensive look. So.
Yes, and we'll link to a few different articles that deal with actually drawing out the detail surrounding the World Trade Center and the real estate transfer and all of that. And you previously mentioned Eisenberg and Glassner, and there's this very interesting article that we'll link to at akamaitree.wordpress.com called Deep Politics and the Supranational Aspects of the Trump Era. And it goes into it draws out lots of this. Actually, almost all parts of what we've been tracing in relationship to this Trump operation. It deals with Adelson, but then it goes into a section that I'll just read quickly through. It says, many important and very strange billionaire megadonors tied to the Israel lobby and associated conservative political circles in the U.S. are connected to or have backed and financed the Trump network. Louis Eisenberg, current U.S. ambassador to Italy. As it happens, Eisenberg was chairman of the Port Authority during 9/11 and prior to 9/11 negotiated a long-term lease for the World Trade Center with Larry Silverstein and his partner Frank Lowy, who, by the way, I believe was in the Golani Brigade, sort of a Zionist militant, potentially terrorist organization. Michael Glassner, the Trump campaign's national political director, was a senior advisor to Eisenberg during Eisenberg's tenure as chairman of the New York Port Authority. Glassner, a Zionist political operative and fixer, was formerly an AIPAC director and has a history of handling politicians endorsed by the Israel lobby, including Sarah Palin, Bob Dole, George W. Bush, and, of course, Donald Trump. And that is key. And we'll also link to a video of me confronting Glassner when he was over here at the Dole Center and asking him about the Epstein-Trump connection, which is also key in here. And this article actually draws out the connections of Trump back to Robert Maxwell, who in some way could be seen as a dual or maybe even more than that agent of both Mossad and KGB, and then also how Rupert Murdoch is somehow the heir apparent in many ways, and even was involved at those times too, coming up. So that's part and parcel of this whole operation. It looks like is the connection through Epstein, and then through his Maxwell's daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, as the sort of key partner in the Epstein blackmail operation that Trump is attached to in many ways over many years. And although people want to focus only on the Clinton attachment, which is very much very real, very material, but there is also a very close Trump attachment connection to the Epstein operation. And Glassner, by the way, is a key operative in all of this. He did then go on to work at he sort of comes through the Eisenberg operation at the Port Authority to put these towers into the Larry Silverstein's private hands just prior to when they were evidently blown up on live television with human beings, 1,000 human beings with basically vaporized, molecularly disassociated little pieces of bone fragments thrown horizontally. This is the evidence for 9/11 treason is so open and so blatant that anybody who supposedly is telling us about 9/11 and doesn't deal with the core of the murder and the core of the open sourcely verifiable treason is, I would say, part of this ongoing counterintelligence operation that serves to distract, contain, disinform about who did what and why in relationship to September 11th. And Glassner, by the way, too, was then went on to sort of moves through the Eisenberg operation very quickly. He was Eisenberg's deputy, helped actually probably help authorize and do the actual paperwork probably that passed the real estate over, and then moves into things like Southwest APAC, directing Southwest APAC, and then also became a similarly close, like the key aide to the head of the corporation. I believe it's called IDT Communications, that was the parent group for Genie Energy. So Genie Energy was spun off from IDT, and that, of course, plays very much into some of the geopolitics of Syria and NATO and Israel. And, of course, on that board is the who's who, including Dick Cheney, Rothschild, Rupert Murdoch, who was the former head of the energy department. I forget it. Or what's his name? The Democrat from New Mexico.
Bill Richardson.
Bill Richardson. So that's blatant. And then so look at that. We'll include that article. And remember also Ehud Barak was also tied to the Epstein operation, right? So these circles are very, very tight here. Who is also tied to Epstein? Dershowitz, who somehow goes from being the sort of liberal defender of civil rights and Israel to making nonsensical statements to protect Donald Trump on live television.
Yeah, it's ironic. Dershowitz, who's like the epitome of the stereotypical like Jewish Zionist that all these like critics of Israel and Zionism love to disparage so much, yet his constant defense of Trump goes completely unnoticed by these people.
Yes. So I'm now going to go back. Let's back up a little bit from this really heavy material open source evidence surrounding Lower Manhattan and the World Trade Center and the who and how and why of all of that. And let's back up into what we were looking at last week, which is some very interesting an article that got put out there through a WikiLeaks dump of Stratfor emails, but by an original article by Wayne Madsen. And now I'm going to read actually from when it was re-released last year in 2017 by Gordon Duff at Veterans Today. And so here it is. Blockbuster. WikiLeaks suppressed Mossad ran 9/11 Arab quote hijacker unquote terrorist operation. And I'm going to read the sort of editorial note on the front end to give another angle to where this story comes from and its lineage that we didn't get from reading the direct WikiLeaks disclosure of it. And by the way, when we reference these stories, again, I'm going to say this, for example, we've gone through a lot of stories by Jay McKenzie, who's part of the citizen journalist, unofficial cooperative of citizen journalists who have done incredible work in tracing the ties between this Trump operation in relationship to Russiagate and specifically the Russian mob. And they've included lots of aspects that obviously tie back into Israel and Jewish power networks too, including Finkelstein and Lauder and those whole crews. And at the same time, they leave out a lot. And so when I want to bring in things like Veterans Today and Gordon Duff, I'm not wholeheartedly endorsing the totality of everything that Gordon Duff has published, or definitely not everything at Veterans Today. I think that we need to learn to treat everything as if it were an intelligence briefing, meaning that we are the ones responsible for clarifying in our own mind, cross-checking with other resources, doing our own internal logical analysis of whether things fit together. Remember that the idea of the trivium, the classical trivium, gather the grammar, meaning the facts. And we know that facts can be either true or false. Most people think that facts mean necessarily true. No, facts mean they can be verified to be true or false. They're objective. But they can also be black propaganda, things that are fed as facts that are actually untrue. So you gather your grammar, then you do a logical analysis of your grammar, and you see where things are not sort of making sense or are incoherent. That means that you either don't have a proper analysis correct, or some of your grammar may be incorrect. Go back to your facts and see what aspects are not working, and see if you can find some more honest, more truthful grammar. And then rhetoric, meaning how do you actually articulate the nature of the analysis, the nature of the understanding. There's almost a public aspect of it where we gather together, either in physical or in the digital sphere, to compare notes and understandings in order to create knowledge. So that's what we're working on here. So even treat this as basically an intelligence briefing. And last week I said, in some way, what we do here, Greg and I, at the Antedote, is we are a We the People collaboration that assesses information in a way that, in an open source sort of counterintelligence way. That's a lot of our focus, meaning that we try to suss out the lines of information and actors and purveyors of that information that are giving bum steers or who are covering up things. And in the midst of that, we then also can potentially supply a briefing that might help us out in terms of what's actually true. All right, so sorry for that side rant here, but let's get into it. Okay, editor's note.
Well, that the VC can be relentless sometimes, so I'm glad you did that. Anyway.
While Julian Assange insists all investigations into 9/11 in Israel are a, quote, waste of time, unquote, we find the, quote, keys to the kingdom, particularly when added to VT's own work, in, of all places, WikiLeaks' own files. We suggest that Assange actually read WikiLeaks. This 2011 article was sourced through WikiLeaks, but came from VT's partner publication in Pakistan, Opinion Maker, and VT editor Raja Mutaba, deceased and missed. WikiLeaks got it from Stratfor, another can of worms, who picked it up from Muchaba, who published it for Madsen, who no longer seems to do this kind of thing. Long story there as well, which we will not go. Suffice it to say, we have been able to verify Madsen's source on this story, and it is totally accurate. We talked to another Madsen source that also gave him information on the Mossad's New York, New Jersey cells that aided in the WTC 9/11 attacks by trying to blow up the George Washington Bridge, the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, and who jammed the first responders' radios using Israeli devices placed on high-rise condos in Fort Lee, New Jersey, controlled by a, quote, Jewish defense organization, unquote. There is more, but we deal with this story and its WikiLeaks heritage and their attempts to bury it. And by the way, what he's referring to is JINSA. JINSA, that is the Jewish Defense Organization that appears to be materially tied into this key area right outside of Manhattan in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and certain high-rise condos connected apparently to the 9/11 operation. So I'm not going to read back through what I read last week. I'm just going to continue it on. And the last sentence that I read last week was that in the middle, the Israelis were the only suspects arrested anywhere in the United States on 9/11 who were thought to have been involved in the 9/11 attacks. The two Mossad teams sent regular coded reports on the progress of the 9/11 operation to Tel Aviv via the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. WMLR, that's Wayne Madsen report, has learned from a Pentagon source that leading Americans tied to the media effort to pin 9/11 on Arab hijackers, Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban were present in the Israeli embassy on September 10th, 2001, to coordinate their media blitz for the subsequent days and weeks following the attacks. It is more than likely that FBI counterintelligence agents who conduct surveillance of the Israeli embassy have proof on the presence of the Americans present at the embassy on September 10th. Some of the Americans are well known to U.S. cable news television audiences. In mid-August, the Mossad team running the Hamburg cell in Boston reported to Tel Aviv that the final plans for 9/11 were set. The Florida-based Mossad cell reported that the documented, quote, unquote, presence of the Arab cell members at Florida flight schools had been established. Remember, okay, and as an aside, what we're tracking right now is the intelligence understanding of this, the creation of the legend, the Patsy operation, how the ongoing mythos of 9/11 as al-Qaeda and the hills of Afghanistan and the Hamburg cell and all of that was actually run. And so it's not the case that is a completely made up scenario. No, this is an intelligence operation. So people were actually being framed is sort of how this all goes down. So back to the story. The two Mossad cells studiously avoided any mention of the World Trade Center or targets in Washington, D.C. in their coded messages to Tel Aviv. Halevi covered his tracks by reporting to the CIA of a, quote, general threat, unquote, by an attack by Arab terrorists on a nuclear plant somewhere on the east coast of the United States. By the way, another aside, remember, this is Ephraim Halevi, the director of Mossad on September 11th, and also tied back in long-term to James Jesus Angleton, the Mossad's man at the highest levels of U.S. intelligence, and the head of both the Israel desk and the head of counterintelligence, and an apparent key mole in the middle of the assassination of President John Kennedy. So, CIA Director George... and by the way, one other thing about this warning. This has always been coded as by sort of the limited hangout people that Israel warned the United States of al-Qaeda's attack, and then there was just either an incompetence, a failure, or a let it happen type of scenario only on the inside of the U.S. intelligence and or FBI counterterrorism. aspects. But if you go look at the actual warning, I think it actually puts the number, about how there's 150 to 200 al-Qaeda people in the U.S. going to do this. And interestingly, if you go look at the year on each side surrounding September 11th, it's about the exact same number of Israeli intelligence agents that are arrested in these very similar type of events or warnings surrounding things like nuclear plants. So that's I think that's interesting in terms of thinking about the framing of this. So the Israelis are framing their own operation at some level, I think you could read it as. Okay, back to the story. CIA Director George Tenet dismissed the Halevi warning as, quote, too nonspecific, unquote. The FBI, under soon-to-be departed Director Louis Freeh, received the, quote, non-specific, unquote, warning about an attack on a nuclear power plant and sent out the information in its routine bulletins to field agents, but no high alert was ordered. The lack of a paper trail pointing to quote-unquote al-Qaeda as the masterminds on 9/11, which could then be linked to al-Qaeda's Mossad handlers, threw off the FBI. On April 19, 2002, FBI Director Robert Mueller, in a speech to San Francisco's Commonwealth Club, stated, quote, in our investigation, we have not uncovered a single piece of paper, either here in the United States or in the treasure trove of information that is turned up in Afghanistan and elsewhere, that mentioned any aspect of the September 11th plot, unquote. The two Mossad, quote-unquote, al-Qaeda infiltration and control teams also helped set up safe houses for the quick exfiltration of Mossad agents from the United States. Last March, WMR reported, quote, WMR has learned from two El Al sources who worked for the Israeli airline at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport that on 9/11, hours after the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, grounded all civilian, domestic, and international incoming and outgoing flights to and from the United States, a full El Al Boeing 747 took off from JFK bound for Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion International Airport. The two El Al employee sources are not Israeli nationals, but legal immigrants from Ecuador who are working in the United States for the airline. The flight departed JFK at 4:11 p.m., and its departure was, according to the El Al sources, authorized by the direct intervention of the U.S. Department of Defense. U.S. military officials were on the scene at JFK and were personally involved with the airport and air traffic control authorities to clear the flight for takeoff. According to the 9/11 Commission report, Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta ordered all civilian flights to be grounded at 9:45 a.m. on September 11th, unquote. WMR has learned from British intelligence sources that the six-man Mossad team was listed on the El Al flight manifest as El Al employees. And an aside, by the way, I believe that the head of Justice criminal investigations on September 11th was Michael Chertoff, who then ultimately became the head of Homeland Security. I believe his mother, who has been asserted to have been a Mossad agent of some sort, she was an El Al stewardess too.
Wow.
VT, back to the story. VT, this is probably an aside by the editors of VT. VT is including the story of the others that filled the 747, a virtual army of Israeli operatives who planned broad attacks that were rolled up by the FBI under Special Agent Mike Dick, running a team put together by John O'Neill and by the NYPD counterterrorism and intelligence organizations who directly contacted us during the attack with details of other outlined Israeli arrests. That's the end of that aside. And by the way, of course, John O'Neill is this famous FBI counterterrorism agent who was killed apparently on September 11th, right after he'd gotten this new job heading up the sort of human security at the World Trade Towers, and it looks like it was someone like Jerome Hauer who had gotten him that job, who was the managing director of Kroll Incorporated on September 11th. And an aside, again, thinking also about counterintelligence and the nature of controlled oppositions across the entire political spectrum. The Left Forum, as I pointed out before, every single year so far in the last years is held in the Kroll Atrium at the John Jay College in New York City, and that is the founder of Kroll Incorporated. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So you have people who are materially tied to so-called security breakdowns on September 11th in Lower Manhattan, sort of who have given the money for the space that then hosts the sort of premier global meeting of leftists that the sort of deep 9/11 truth is apparently not allowed into.
Indeed. How much more of this article is there?
There is a little bit more.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd say we're probably more than halfway through.
Okay.
So I'll try to stop making so many asides. But if you want to do an aside, just pop in there, Greg, too. Okay.
That sounds good.
All right. WMR previously reported that the Mossad cell operating in the Jersey City Weehawken area of New Jersey through Urban Moving Systems was suspected by some in the FBI and CIA of being involved in moving explosives into the World Trade Center, as well as staging quote-unquote false flag demonstrations at least 2 locations in North Jersey, Liberty State Park, and an apartment complex in Jersey City as the first plane hit the World Trade Center's North Tower. One other aside is, by the way, that there is that reporting that there was an anonymous phone call about saying these guys in the Sheikh uniforms are celebrating 9/11, and so then thinking also back through this whole thing of Donald Trump insisting, then being given a platform on Alex Jones's InfoWars show early on in the campaign to double down on this thing about Muslims celebrating, when this is the actual arrest record is Israeli intelligence celebrating potentially as false flags, but also probably legitimately excited in some sadistically violent fashion about what it meant, for their so-called national security, and what it actually meant about the deeper operation right into the heart of Manhattan and how those buildings and the people in them were destroyed. Back to the story. One team of Urban Moving Systems Mossad agents was arrested later on September 11th and jailed for 5 months at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Some of their names turned up in a joint CIA-FBI database as known Mossad agents, along with the owner of Urban Moving Systems, Dominic Suter, whose name also appeared on a, quote, law enforcement sensitive, unquote, FBI 9/11 suspects list, along with the names of key quote-unquote hijackers, including Mohammed Atta and Hani Hanjar, as well as the so-called 20th hijacker, Zacharias Moussaoui. Suter was allowed to escape the United States after the FBI made initial contact with him at the Urban Moving Systems warehouse in Weehawken, New Jersey, following the 9/11 attacks. Suter was later permitted to return to the United States, where he was involved in the aircraft's parts supply business in southern Florida, according to an informed source who contacted WMR. And that there's an aside, there's an interesting potential piece to that I will explore later in relationship to Antedote investigations that might have to do with the only U.S. attorney who's ever been assassinated while on the job, which was on October 11th, 2001, exactly a month after September 11th, who was involved with potential fraud cases that had to do with aircraft parts and supplies. And there's also there's a piece also here that relates to Bolin's research into 9/11 and the planes. So interested researchers should go look into that. Suter, back to the story. Suter later filed for bankruptcy in Florida for Urban Moving Systems and other businesses he operated. Suburban Moving and Storage Incorporated, Max Movers Incorporated, InView Support, Wood Flooring Warehouse Corp., One Stop Cleaning LLC, and City Carpet Upholstery Inc. At the time of the bankruptcy filing in Florida, Suter listed his address as 1867 Fox Court, Wellington, Florida, 33414, with a phone number of, I'm just going to leave this out. From the list of creditors, it can be determined that Suter had been operating in the United States since 1993, the year of the first attack on the World Trade Center. In 1993, Suter began racking up American Express credit card charges totaling $21,913.97. Suter also maintained credit card accounts with HSBC Bank and Orchard Bank, care of HSBC Card Services of Salinas, California, among other banks. Suter also did business with the Jewish Community Center of Greater Palm Beach in Florida and Ryder Trucks in Miami. Miami and southern Florida were major operating areas for cells of Israeli Mossad agents masquerading as quote-unquote art students who were living and working near some of the identified future Arab quote-unquote hijackers in the months preceding 9/11, explained below. ABC's 2020 correspondent John Miller ensured that the Israeli connections to quote-unquote al-Qaeda's Arab hijackers was buried in a quote-unquote investigation of the movers' activities on 9/11. Anchor Barbara Walters helped Miller in putting a lid on the story about the movers, and Suter aired on June 21st, 2002. Miller then went on to become the FBI public affairs spokesman to ensure that Mueller and other FBI officials kept to the quote-unquote al-Qaeda script as determined by the Bush administration and the future 9/11 Commission. And aside, Miller is a key figure here. He also then moved to Los Angeles with Bratton when Bratton was in the process of working for Kroll as oversight for the LAPD in relationship to unconstitutional actions. And then Bratton also then was involved, as I said before, in setting up this first fusion center with John Miller, I believe, as his spokesman and at his side. So this Miller guy is a key figure to look into too. He's an FBI guy, but then he's also a journalist. He's on TV, and he's just moving all around. Okay, back to the story. But former CIA chief of counterterrorism Vincent Canestraro let slip to ABC an important clue to the operations of the Mossad movers in New Jersey when he stated that the Mossad agents, quote, set up or exploited for the purpose of launching an intelligence operation against radical Islamists in the area, particularly in the New Jersey, New York area, unquote. The quote-unquote intelligence operation turned out to have been the actual 9/11 attacks. And it was no coincidence that it was ABC's John Miller who conducted a May 1998 rare interview of Osama bin Laden at his camp in Afghanistan. Bin Laden played his part well for future scenes in the fictional quote-unquote made-for-TV drama known as 9/11. WMR has also learned from Italian intelligence sources that Mossad's running of quote-unquote al-Qaeda operatives did not end with running the quote-unquote hijacking teams in the United States and Hamburg. Other Arab quote-unquote al-Qaeda operatives run by Mossad were infiltrated into Syria but arrested by Syrian intelligence. Syria was unsuccessful in turning them to participate in intelligence operations in Lebanon. Detailed information on bin Laden's support team was offered to the Bush administration up to days prior to 9/11 by Qutb al-Mahdi, the head of the Sudanese Mukhabarat intelligence service. The intelligence was rejected by the Bush White House. It was later reported that Sudanese members of quote-unquote al-Qaeda's support network were double agents for Mossad, who had also established close contacts with Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh and operated in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Eritrea, as well as Sudan. The Mossad connection to al-Qaeda in Sudan was likely known by the Sudanese Mukhabarat, a reason for the rejection of its intelligence on quote-unquote al-Qaeda by the thoroughly Mossad-penetrated Bush White House. An aside, isn't that interesting how Sudan then is also named as one of the targets, right, in the war on terror?
Indeed. Yeah, and there was that whole South Sudan thing, and there's the propaganda campaign there with Darfur and South Sudan. I don't know how it all figures into that, but clearly after September 11th, there was very much a propaganda campaign directly related to Sudan.
So there's still a good little bit more of this. I think I'm going to try to just rush through it if that's okay, Greg, or we can put it aside for now.
Go for it. We got another show that we're going to be doing to follow up on this, so we're okay.
Maybe we'll just continue on this route here and try to track all of this down. Yemen had also identified quote unquote al-Qaeda members who were also Mossad agents. Look at all these targets, right? Look at all these national targets who are the ones who are identifying al-Qaeda as Mossad.
Yeah.
Right?
And Yemen is very key right now. There's a well documented war campaign going on with Yemen right now. So
yes. Okay. Yemen had also identified quote unquote al-Qaeda members who were also Mossad agents. A former chief of Mossad revealed to this editor in 2002 that Yemeni-born Mossad quote-unquote deep insertion commandos spotted bin Laden in the Hadramaut region of eastern Yemen after his escape from Tora Bora in Afghanistan following the U.S. Invasion. That's very interesting points here. And actually that makes me think of, there's a book by Christopher Bolin that he's put out recently. It's small. It's called The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. And in chapter 8, it's titled Creating the Foe. And there's a quote in the beginning. It says, if there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no IS, Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh now. Buka was a factory. It made us all. It built our ideology, unquote, by Abu Ahmed, senior official of ISIS in ISIS, the inside story by The Guardian on December 11th of 2014. But in the rest of this chapter, Creating the Foe, Bolin lays out how the Charlie Wilson's War, that's the famed book and the backing information about the U.S. intelligence backing of what became Al-Qaeda by way of
a movie starring Tom Hanks. So.
Good point. By way of by way of supporting the Mujahideen, and of course this is where bin Laden enters the story, that there was this whole aspect to that that's highly related to Israeli military intelligence, and that high levels of the DC Mossad chief was allowed to set up in Charlie Wilson's office to do his operations. And then Bolin also then points out that Ali Mohammed, who's this key sort of seen as a double and triple agent by all of the people pushing the limited hangout things, from Peter, from Lance to the Looming Towers, which is now a big Hulu thing that Robbie Martin had on the two authors of this key new book that were touting the Hulu TV show of the Looming Towers as important for the backup on that. But meanwhile, it turns out that Israeli military intelligence was at the helm of the training in Afghanistan during this operation, when Ali Mohammed supposedly was the one who helped train Al-Qaeda and is the sort of key insertion in relationship to bin Laden, and that Ali Mohammed is the guy who's actually planning these operations, including some of the attacks on U.S. embassies in Africa. And it turns out that one Ehud Barak, who we mentioned before, right, tied into Larry Silverstein directly, tied into Jeffrey Epstein directly, and on BBC on September 11th, that Ehud Barak was the head of Amman, Israeli military intelligence, during these key years, 83 through 85, that Ali Mohammed was getting planted and put in there. So I think most recently, Black Cube, via helping with the Harvey Weinstein Black Cube aspect of things, and of course Black Cube also dug up dirt on opponents of the Iran nuclear deal, therefore basically doing work on behalf of the Trump administration. Very, very good point. And people should also go look back at the our show from about a month ago that described your call into C-SPAN in relationship to Ben Rhodes. And you've pointed out some new stories about Ben Rhodes, who was targeted by Black Cube, sort of cut out corporate Israeli intelligence in relationship to the Iran deal, and talking about how much control the Netanyahu administration was asserting domestically and internally in relationship to the Obama administration.
I believe he said that he had never seen. I believe he said that this was an unprecedented amount of foreign interference in an American administration.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So back to the story here. French intelligence determined that other Egyptian and Yemeni-born Jewish Mossad agents were infiltrated into Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates as radical members of the Muslim Brotherhood. However, the quote-unquote Muslim Brotherhood agents actually were involved in providing covert Israeli funding for quote-unquote al-Qaeda activities. On February 21st, 2006, WMR reported on the U.S. Treasury Secretary's firing by President Bush over information discovered on the shady quote-unquote al-Qaeda accounts in the United Arab Emirates. Quote, banking insiders in Dubai report that in March 2002, U.S. Secretary of Treasury Paul O'Neill visited Dubai and asked for documents on a $109,000 500 money transfer from Dubai to a joint account held by hijackers Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi at SunTrust Bank in Florida. O'Neill also asked UAE authorities to close down accounts used by al-Qaeda. The UAE complained about O'Neill's demands to the Bush administration. O'Neill's pressure on the UAE and Saudis contributed to Bush firing him as Treasury Secretary in December 2002. O'Neill may have also... that's unquote, I think now. So back to this current story. O'Neill may have also stumbled on the quote-unquote Muslim Brotherhood Mossad operatives operating in the Emirates who were directing funds to quote-unquote al-Qaeda. And an aside here and back to O'Neill, John O'Neill, who was apparently killed on September 11th, who was tracking all of this down. And again, the authors of this new book that's been featured in Newsweek, that were interviewed by Robbie Martin very recently in the Media Roots podcast, they poo-poo entirely as some type of conspiracy theory that should be related to things like lizard people with space beam weapons on 9/11, to just considering the possibility that John O'Neill was subjected to a potential intelligence operation when his briefcase of classified materials, he was looking into all of these networks at the time, went missing apparently, and then was returned a few hours later. And then it was apparently, this was leaked into the press I believe in the New York Times at a key moment that somehow undid his rise into the his further going down the road of these investigations, and he ended up leaving the FBI, maybe being pushed out, and then somehow being brought in by one credibly accused 9/11 suspect, Jerome Hauer, who also was apparently aware of the anthrax threat before it happened, talking about putting the White House on Cipro. And yet these so-called journalists who are pushing forth Richard Clarke's narrative about September 11th, so-called intelligence breakdowns. And by the way, Richard Clarke is a well-known, identified Israeli spy suspect, going way, way back, even back to that whole story that we covered around the mega group. He was one of the key people that was being looked at by U.S. counterintelligence in relationship to Israeli moles in the White House. So I don't go for it.
Yeah, he's a hero. I mean, I don't know if I would call him so much as a hero, but he's certainly somebody who was very well regarded within this community of Saudis did 9/11, missed warnings and hijackers and all this. And I believe even Amy Goodman had him on to do a mea culpa about regretting certain things he was part of in the Bush administration. So, yeah,
and I remember back in the day that your government failed you was Richard Clarke's big line to the 9/11 Commission and to the family members and all of that, and that's when he was regarded so-called as a hero. I remember the DC 9/11 group crossed it out and said your government killed you, and so then maybe we should actually advance it to be like your government, elements of your government allowed Israel to kill you. I think that would actually be the most accurate in terms of the up-to-date open source evidence about who did 9/11 and why. Okay, back to the story. Let's see if we can wrap this up before we have to finish the episode. Okay. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan, Sharjah's ruler Sultan bin Mohammed al-Qasimi, who survived a palace coup attempt in 1987, opened his potentate to Russian businessmen like Victor Bout, as well as to financiers of radical Muslim groups, including the Taliban and quote-unquote al-Qaeda. Moreover, this Israeli support for quote-unquote al-Qaeda was fully known to Saudi intelligence, which approved of it in order to avoid compromising Riyadh. The joint joint Israeli-Saudi support for quote-unquote al-Qaeda was well known to the Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah-based aviation network of the now imprisoned Russian Victor Bout, jailed in New York on terrorism charges. The presence of Bout in New York, a hotbed of Israeli intelligence control of U.S. federal prosecutors, judges, as well as the news media, is no accident. Bout knows enough about the Mossad activities in Sharjah in support of the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, where Bout also had aviation and logistics contracts to expose Mossad as the actual mastermind behind 9/11. Bout's aviation empire also extended to Miami and Dallas, two areas that were nexuses for the Mossad control operations for the quote-unquote al-Qaeda flight training operations of the Arab cell members in the months prior to 9/11.
And a quick aside, also, that would appear to be two hotbeds, perhaps for action related to John F. Kennedy as well. So,
really good point. It says VT has confirmed the sources on all of this as well. Back to the story. Bout's path also crossed with a quote-unquote al-Qaeda support network at the same bank in Sharjah, HSBC. Mossad's phony Muslim Brotherhood members from Egypt and Yemen controlled financing for quote-unquote al-Qaeda through the HSBC accounts in Sharjah. Mossad's Dominique Suter also dealt with HSBC in the United States. The FBI's chief counterterrorism agent investigating al-Qaeda, John O'Neill, became aware of the quote-unquote unique funding mechanisms for al-Qaeda. It was no mistake that O'Neill was given the job as director of security for the World Trade Center on the eve of the attack. O'Neill perished in the collapse of the complex. Mossad uses a number of Jews born in Arab countries to masquerade as Arabs. They often carry forged or stolen passports from Arab countries or nations in Europe that have large Arab immigrant populations, particularly Germany, France, Britain, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands. For Mossad, the successful 9/11 terrorist quote-unquote false flag operation was a success beyond expectations. The Bush administration, backed by the Blair government, attacked and occupied Iraq, deposing Saddam Hussein and turning up pressure on Israel's other adversaries, including Iran, Syria, Pakistan, Hamas, and the Lebanese Hezbollah. The Israelis also saw the U.S., Britain, and the UN begin to crack down on the Lebanese Shia diamond business in Democratic Republic of Congo and West Africa, and with it the logistics support provided by Bout's aviation companies, which resulted in a free hand for Tel Aviv to move in on Lebanese diamond deals in Central and West Africa. Remember that, an aside there, remember how tightly this is, and also to these Chabad billionaire diamond networks like Lev Leviyev surrounding Trump and Kushner. And so anybody who's interested in tracing down these sort of Russian mob ties to the Russian government and to Trump and to Israel might want to look into this Bout connection here too, into 9/11. Just one last paragraph here. Then Israeli Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu commented on the 9/11 attacks on U.S. television shortly after they occurred. Netanyahu said, quote, "It is very good," unquote. It now appears that Netanyahu, in his zeal, blew Mossad's cover as the masterminds of 9/11. And that's the end of it. Wayne Madsen is a Washington, D.C. based investigative journalist, author, and syndicated columnist. He has written for several renowned papers and blogs. And we have about a minute left. Greg, any final comments?
Well, first of all, I'll say we talked a few weeks ago about Roger Stone, and this article makes it further obvious why someone like Wayne Madsen can no longer be affiliated with the InfoWars operation, as Alex Jones and Roger Stone are trying to pin 9/11 on the head of Robert Mueller. So that's one thing that stuck out to me. And another one, and we're going to follow up on this next week, as you just described a lot of the actual on the ground type of operations that led to this event. And I guess next week we're going to follow up on this by getting back, moving this back into, I guess, what you would call aspects of counterintelligence, which is this effort to really pin this attack on Saudi Arabia, which has got a lot of media coverage. And we're going to, I guess, tie together some of the problems with that narrative and some of the more, I would say, maybe dubious, questionable figures involved in pushing the Saudi narrative. And we probably will retouch back onto this Newsweek article and this book by the creators of 9/11 Press for Truth and some of the figures that are involved with that whole thing. So anyway, Jeremy, I guess if you have any final thoughts.
No, yes, we'll get back into that, including the relationship to the Russian mob in Israel, including Semyon Mogilevich, appearance and deep involvement in Israel in these key times during the rise of the Netanyahu administration, whether that might be involved in this. But until next week, Antedote.